Hey, this is Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics in board games, and that is intertwined mechanisms and themes. When I sit down to design a game, I usually start out with a mechanical idea or a thematic idea, and right away I'm kind of matching that mechanism with a theme or that theme with a mechanism, and that gets jumbled on my brainstorming pieces of paper right away. And eventually I'm working towards fun. That's the eventual goal. But that intertwining of theme and mechanisms and vice versa is always really, really interesting for me to see in games. And it's also really neat for me to see in games when they do that so well in a way that makes the game easier to teach and easier to learn and easier to remember. So today I'm going to highlight more than my usual top 10. I'm going to highlight 23 games where I think the theme and mechanisms intertwine in a really clever, immersive way. And I ended up breaking this list down into 4 different categories. And actually, the 5th category are the honorable mentions as submitted by Stonemaier ambassadors. So those are Battlestar Galactica, Blood Rage, Dungeon Lords, Trickerion, Flamme Rouge, Euphoria, Pandemic Legacy, Tang Garden, the Quacks of Quedlinburg, Lisboa, Scythe, Twilight Struggle, the Gallerist, Western Legends, and Downforce. I picked the games for this list partially based on how much I enjoyed them. That's always going to be part of my bias when I make these lists, but also part of just how clever I think oftentimes the specific mechanism is as it ties to the theme of the game. So let's jump right in. Let's start with the first category I have is card design. So I'm looking for games where the cards in the game are designed really well for a thematic mix of mechanisms and theme. And so the first game I have on that list, I actually have to dig it out a little bit here, is Wingspan. What actually drew me to Wingspan originally as a publisher was how many unique bird cards Elizabeth had created, and even just the first prototype, and how the theme for those birds informed the mechanisms themselves. I just thought that was amazingly well done, and I continue to be in awe of Elizabeth's talents of designing new birds. We're now up to how many? This is the game that my company publishes. We published, I don't know, over 300 different bird types at this point, which is just incredible. Elizabeth keeps coming out with new abilities that fit the themes. And I know from talking to her that it is definitely a theme-first game. She looks at a bird with an interesting kind of backstory or what that bird does in real life that's very interesting, and she finds a mechanism to fit that bird. So Wingspan is on this list of great card design for theme and mechanisms. Next up, I have Agricola. I think Agricola is a classic farming game from Uwe Rosenberg, and it does a wonderful job of having all these unique cards that represent different people and buildings, and every one of those cards seems to me to be a theme-first design with a mechanism that makes sense for that theme. And that actually might be a common theme as I'm talking about this topic, where once you get down to it, even if your game idea starts out with a mechanism and you find a theme to fit that mechanism, when it gets down to it, I think all of these specific elements of games where themes and mechanisms intertwine really well and mesh well, they often start with a theme first idea for like a card, and then the mechanisms spring from that. It can happen the other way around too, but I bet it happens more often with theme first. It definitely does for me in my designs. Also on this list is Everdell. Just played Everdell recently myself in a treehouse, actually. And I think the cards in Everdell, I'm still in the cards category here, the cards are really well designed to fit mechanisms and theme. Most of the cards or all of the cards I believe, are either buildings or are little critters that occupy your village. And not only are the abilities for the cards thematically well designed, but also I like in Everdell how if you already have like a certain critter or a certain building, then it makes a corresponding critter or building, a specific one, free to play. You don't have to pay the cost. So I think if you have a farm, then you can get the farmer to show up at the farm for free. It might be the opposite of that, but I really like that aspect in Everdell. Also in well-designed cards is Terraforming Mars. Terraforming Mars, I think, does a fantastic job of having so many unique cards that really fit the theme and the mechanisms, down to the cost, down to the abilities, and just the variety of cards in Terraforming Mars. There must be hundreds of them at this point. They're all like designed, and I really like the kind of the science first approach for Terraforming Mars. Many of the cards seem like they are designed with this science in mind, and then the abilities spring forth from that science. Really, this isn't numbered, but the fifth game that I'm going to mention here is Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is a cooperative game, a cooperative survival game, and there's a big deck of cards in Robinson Crusoe where a card pops up and it says something like, a bee stings you, what do you do? And you can either say, okay, I'm going to go out of my way to treat this sting and deal with it, or I'll just ignore it and see what happens. And then later on, that same card, if you don't deal with it, that same card could come up later in a separate deck, a separate event deck, and because you haven't dealt with it, then something bad could happen, or even something good could happen, but usually it's a bad thing. But you don't actually know if that thing is going to happen, because sometimes when you get a bad bee sting, nothing bad happens, but sometimes if you don't deal with it, something bad will happen. So the card design in Robinson Crusoe, and just the immersion and the stories those cards tell based on whether or not you deal with them or not is off the charts. It's really, really good. And then last, I have Watergate. I mentioned Twilight Struggle on the honorable mentions list. I really like Watergate of this style of game where it's an asymmetric two-player game. One player represents the press, and the other represents Nixon's office. And they're clashing against one another and trying to hide information, to reveal information. But the card design in Watergate is really, really good. Every card is designed with a specific historical element in mind, and what you're doing with that card and what you benefit from that card, what you gain from it, is very thematic, and as represented by the mechanisms on those cards. So those are that's the category of great card design for thematic and mechanical intertwining immersion. Next, I'll go with simulation. So these are games where I think the game is essentially a simulation of something you're doing. Even as I'm talking about this, I'm going to mention a game that's not officially on the list, but Freedom: The Underground Railroad, I think, is a fantastic simulation of a very dark period in United States history. I didn't think of that when I was making this list, so I won't put that on there officially, but Freedom: The Underground Railroad I'll mention. The first game I'll mention for simulation is Millennium Blades. Millennium Blades is a tabletop game about a collectible card game in this alternate universe where there's a very, very popular collectible card game. And so you're playing this collectible card game in Millennium Blades, even though you're not actually collecting any cards. Millennium Blades itself is not a collectible card game. But every element of it is just designed so precisely to fit this feeling of building decks, of opening packs, of trading, of selling, of participating in tournaments. It's so well done from a simulation perspective. Kanban. So I wanted to include a list from a designer who's designed a number of these games that are on the honorable mentions list. It's Vital Lacerda. And Kanban is a game about making cars. I haven't played the newer version of it. I think there's like an EV version of Kanban. I played the original version. But it really does take you through the process of making and selling cars really well. This is kind of Vital Lacerda's thing. He makes games that simulate something very specific, often getting really into the weeds of what that simulation is. And I think sometimes that gets in the way of the fun of the game. But I know heavy gamers really, really enjoy his games. And I am really impressed by how well he incorporates his theme into the mechanisms of the game, even if they get a little fiddly at times. So they're so precise in how he does it. But Kanban, I think, definitely deserves to be on this list. Treasure Island. Treasure Island is a game where one player has hidden some treasure on an island, and that player can really choose almost any location on the island. It's not like you have a set of cards, you can choose one of those cards, that represents the location. You choose like a tiny little pinprick on this island, and that's where you hid your treasure, that's where you buried it. And the rest of the players are essentially interrogating you over the course of the game to get information about where that treasure may be, and they're drawing on this map to figure out where it is. And it really feels like everything that I just described. It feels like you're interrogating a pirate who is slowly breaking his way out of jail, who hid a treasure, and hoping to race to get that treasure before you do. That's Treasure Island. Viticulture. I think Viticulture is a pretty good simulation of what it's like to make wine. It certainly distills certain elements of winemaking, but it goes through the process of you're building buildings so that like a trellis. You're building a trellis so that you can plant vines that grow over that trellis, and once you plant those vines, you can pluck grapes off those vine cards. You're not uprooting the cards. That's a common mistake in viticulture for some reason. People want to tear those cards off their fields. But when you collect grapes, you're not actually uprooting the vines. You're just grabbing little grapes off the vines, and then you're turning those grapes into wine and then selling that wine. Meanwhile, you're having, like in many modern vineyards and wineries, you're having visitors visit the vineyard, and you're benefiting from those visitors. And sometimes in vineyards, they are selling grapes to wineries. So not every vineyard actually makes a lot of wine. Sometimes they just grow grapes and they sell those grapes to other places. So I did a lot of research into winemaking process and vineyards while I was designing viticulture, and I think that made its way into the final game. What else do I have under simulation? Oh yeah, For Sale. This is definitely the lightest game on this list, and it certainly is abstracted in certain ways, but at its core, in For Sale, you are buying properties or obtaining properties by spending as little money as possible, and then you are selling those properties for as much money as possible. And that's it. That's the whole game. But I think it incorporates that element of buying and selling real estate into the game in such a nice distilled way that it does feel like a simulation of someone who is just kind of buying properties and flipping them right away, as we see in today's real estate market. And last on this list, I have Spirit Island. I honestly wasn't exactly sure where to put Spirit Island on this list because it is so thematically well designed. From the spirit design, each player represents a spirit that are kind of fighting these colonists from colonizing the island, to what the colonists themselves are doing, automated. That's an automated element of the game. The colonists are spreading out trying to conquer this island, as well as even the natives on that island, the people who were originally on the island, and how they are aiding the spirits to fight against the colonists. So overarching, I think Spirit Island is a great simulation. And it's kind of a weird simulation here because it's not really tied to real life, but it somehow feels like a simulation of a game where spirits do exist and can fight against people who are trying to colonize their island. The next category is feeling. I wasn't exactly sure how to categorize this, but it just has these games kind of ooze with a certain feeling. They evoke a certain feeling due to how the theme and mechanisms are intertwined. The first game on this list is Obsession. Obsession is a very recent play of mine that's kind of like Downton Abbey, the game, where you're running this estate and you're in the countryside of I believe maybe early 1900s England, and you're inviting guests to your estate, and those guests and you're kind of managing the people on your estate. So you have different types of people on the estate, different little workers that you're assigning to do different things. They're basically running activities. So what you mainly do on your turn, and I love this element of the theme of the game, that you have nothing better to do than just have activities, than to run activities on this estate in Obsession. And so you run an activity, and some guests usually show up to participate in that activity. And sometimes you invite specific guests that might benefit you in certain ways. They might help your reputation or hurt your reputation. And at other times, you might just put out an open invitation and a random guest will show up, and you have to deal with that guest if they're unruly, or benefit from that guest if they turn out to be a great guest of honor. And even with your reputation, you can invite better kind of people with better reputation. If your reputation is better, they're not going to show up at your estate if your reputation is really low. It falls into that whole genre of Downton Abbey, of like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, all those types of books and movies. Just wonderful. It really does feel like you are running an estate, which is what I'm getting at. Next is A War of Whispers. I think this is essentially the best version of a Game of Thrones game, even though it isn't Game of Thrones themed, because in A War of Whispers, you are not conquering the world. You are not like a faction conquering the world. Instead, you are kind of behind the scenes, whispering in the ears of different people and steering these armies around the world, even though you are not controlling them, in the hopes that the armies that you've kind of placed your bets on, that you hope are doing well, will do better than the ones that you hope won't do well. And so oftentimes in A War of Whispers, you are kind of pitting one army against one another with the hopes of something happening that will benefit the armies, plural, that you are backing. But just this kind of duplicitous, behind the scenes, sneaky whispering and manipulation, that is what was really intriguing about the Game of Thrones TV show to me. And I thought that A War of Whispers captured that feeling really, really well. Nemesis. Nemesis is a game I've talked about a lot recently because I think Nemesis does a fantastic job of evoking the feeling of being on a spaceship where there are creatures that are probably there. You don't really know. You can't find them yet. That might pop out at certain times. The creatures can go away at certain times. They can kind of disappear into the night. The injuries you can get in Nemesis, they can impact you in certain ways. The way that fighting, you're not very good at fighting in Nemesis. Even the best fighting character isn't very good at fighting because when humans are fighting aliens, or giant aliens like in Nemesis, the aliens are always going to have the upper hand. Just every little element of Nemesis, even if it gets a little fiddly at times, ends up working because I think it evokes the theme so well, and the mechanisms and the themes match so well in Nemesis. Next up is the King's Dilemma. I also wasn't exactly sure where to put the King's Dilemma on this list, but similar to War of Whispers, the King's Dilemma really feels like you are in a council that is steering a country. And so like everything that you are actually doing in the King's Dilemma is trying to kind of manipulate and argue with and kind of take a stand with your fellow advisors so that you can manipulate the kingdom in a way that benefits you. And like I say that very literally, like there isn't like an abstracted mechanism that represents negotiation. You are really out loud saying, please join me with this, or I'll support you. You can bribe players with money in the game. As you try to steer the kingdom, and it really feels like you are on a council to the king or the queen. So that is the King's Dilemma in this category of a game feeling like what it's trying to represent. Next up is Time Stories. Again, Time Stories, I wasn't exactly sure where to put on this, but I wanted to mention Time Stories for one specific reason. That is that the thing that I love most about Time Stories, which is this idea where you walk into a room or a new environment and you see this panorama of cards spread out before you. And the panorama is actual art of what you are seeing with your eyes, first-person vision. So you're not looking down on the world like many of these games. You're looking at the world from a first-person perspective. And you are deciding cooperatively kind of what you want to go check out. Like if you walked into an actual room and you said, okay, I want to go look at that corner over there. And you go look at that corner, you pick up the card, you read what's on the back of the card, you look at some of the art on the back of the card, and then you put it down and then walk back to the middle of the room essentially and share what you saw and what you experienced with other players. That is, in its essence, what Time Stories is. And like I just described, I described that in a very thematic way because the mechanical thing that you're doing in the game is represented by the theme in Time Stories. So yeah, that's Time Stories. Definitely, I think, is a good portion of this list. And last, we have Legendary Encounters Alien. So kind of similar to Nemesis, this is an alien-themed game where you have aliens that are creeping through a ship and are going to show up at different times. This is a deck-building game, and it's a little more abstracted, I would say, than Nemesis, but that abstraction almost aids it because all you're having is you have this row of cards that are face down. They represent the different creatures that are sneaking up on you, but you can't see them yet. You can kind of hear them. You know they're there, but you don't know how bad they are or what they are. And so you have the choice in Legendary Encounters to try to reveal those cards early, to go looking for them essentially, and try to find out what they are and deal with them before they strike. Or you can wait for them to strike and then deal with them. Just that exact element of the game, I think, just really evokes this feeling of dread. Like, what is this thing that's creeping up on us? We can see it, or we can't see it. We can hear it. We know it's coming. We can't do anything about it coming. Do we try to find out what it is and deal with it now, or wait till we deal with it later? The last category I have is kind of a catch-all. I'm calling it precision. So when there's a certain element of the game, or even a general element of the game that really fits the theme and the mechanisms where they match well. The first one on this list is Dune Imperium. Dune Imperium, I had not read Dune before playing Dune Imperium, but once I played the game and I saw how well the theme was integrated into the mechanisms, I was like, I want to know more about this world. And I ended up reading the book. I recently ended up really enjoying the movie. But it could have gone in the card design category, but for me specifically, I was really intrigued by the different influence tracks, like the Spacing Guild. What was so special about the Spacing Guild? Why do they have these cards in the Spacing Guild that can pretty much do anything or go anywhere? The Bene Gesserit, these kind of magical science fiction witches. that have these special abilities, they get you intrigue cards in this game, and so they're kind of behind the scenes manipulating things and changing the rules of the game. There's the Emperor, who's just has an abundance of money that the Emperor can bestow upon you, and the Fremen who value water so highly, and also know how to find water and find spice. All these different, this is me describing the game just based on these tracks in the game, and what you gain from those tracks. But I think that was so well done in Dune Imperium. And also, I don't know, the things you can do on the planet versus the things you can do in the council are different. I just think this game is dripping with theme, even though you're just moving around cubes and workers and playing a deck building game. Just so good at precisely having mechanisms match the theme. Also on this list is Last Will. Last Will is a very peculiar one because Last Will has kind of a wacky theme, which is that you have you are in line to inherit a lot of money. If you, and I hope I'm saying this correctly, if you spend the money that you have first. So you are trying to bankrupt yourself in Last Will. That's the theme. It doesn't really match what you would be doing in real life unless you had a wacky uncle who gave you that challenge when he passed away. But every element of the game fits with this wacky theme. The game gives you so many ways to spend money, and you're trying desperately to get rid of the money. And every mechanism in the game is geared towards that, giving you ways to spend money in crazy, wacky, often memorable ways so that you can get rid of all that money the fastest. So that's Last Will. I also have Burgle Brothers, maybe one of the smallest boxes on this list. Burgle Brothers is a cooperative heist game, and it does a lot of things well with that heist, but the thing that I think it does the best is how you can manipulate the guards in the game. All this is very abstracted, but the guard system, you're essentially trying to find ways to get the guard to move away from you in the game. And it really feels like you might make an alarm go off. You might throw something at another room. You might make a commotion in the bathroom and then run out of the bathroom so that the guard will hear that and move towards the bathroom while you're doing something else in another room. Every time you are thinking about the guard, and you are constantly thinking about the guard, I feel like the mechanisms and the theme come to life in this heist game. And even beyond that, there's other things that it does really well where theme mechanisms mesh well, but I think that is the guard manipulation is at the top of the list for me. A late addition to this list, I added this at the last minute. I was looking at my shelf. Villainous. I think Villainous does a fantastic job of really making you feel like each villain that you're representing. This is probably the most asymmetric game on this list. Where in Villainous, you are a villain and you are trying to be the most villainous of all the villains. And every villain is really designed so well to represent in this case, Marvel, but often Disney villains, the classic Disney villains that you're representing. You have your own unique deck. You have these locations that are specific to you as a villain. And you're taking actions on those locations. You can impact other players. You can do villainous things that impact other players, oftentimes with what we consider the heroes of these worlds. I think Villainous just does a fantastic job of intertwining theme and mechanisms through its asymmetry. And last on the list, I wanted to throw in one game from Mind Clash Games, and that is Anachrony. Anachrony is a time travel game. And there are two specific things I think that Anachrony does really well thematically. One is you are dealing with kind of a post-apocalyptic world, and to go out in the world, to escape from, or to get out of your little bubble, your safe bubble, you have to climb into a mech suit to protect yourself. And so that in itself, I think, is a really cool mechanism, and it's represented in the game by these actual little mech suit miniatures that you put your little token in, and you go out in the world. So just even that tangible, that tactile element of putting yourself inside another component before you can venture out and take these worker placement spots that are outside in the world, I think works really well for theme and mechanisms. The other element, and the reason that I almost considered publishing Anachrony, it was originally pitched to me a long time ago, was the idea of sending yourself something from the future. There's time travel in this game. And so in Anachrony, if you need a certain resource from the future, you can send it to yourself. But then when you get to that point in the future, you need to still have that resource so that you can send it back to yourself. That is such a clever mechanism. It's so cleverly executed. And the theme, even though it's time travel, I can explain it to you in a thematic way, and hopefully in a way that makes sense. Last on this list, I have Anachrony. So those are the 4 categories: great card design, simulation, evoking a feeling, and then precision, some sort of a game that really precisely represents a theme and mechanisms where they intertwine well. I'd love to hear your picks for these categories. There are many games that I think I've missed, and maybe you want to highlight one of the honorable mentions that I didn't highlight it quite as much. But in all these categories, I'd love to hear your favorite game, or the game that you think does a great job or the best job at intertwining theme and mechanisms in those 4 categories. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks.